This video is going to be about defamation. Defamation is the making of statements, written or oral, which are either careless as to whether they will, or intended to, reduce the standing of an identifiable person in the community. You notice it doesn't say untrue. Whether or not they're true, or whether or not you have justification for saying them, is actually a defence to the charge, rather than part of the charge. It's been around since Roman times. There's a Praetorian edict of 140 AD in which it describes defamation as statements made in public which are designed to lower your moral standing. Many people who are students of history might ask, what moral standings in Rome? Well, it's true in Rome they had certain different moral and ethical values to what we have today. But they did have, for instance, in the terms of sexual behaviour, two forms of sex. They had copulation and fornication. Copulation were those things that was considered acceptable to society, and it could include sex with a prostitute, sex with a concubine, sex with a prostitute no matter what age or gender, sex with a slave, and of course sex with your wife. Fornication were those things that were thought to be bad for society and disruptive for society. In a patriarchal society where inheritance was important and were maintaining a stable society, sex with your brother's wife, your sister-in-law, would certainly be considered fornication. Sex with your friend's wife or someone of similar standing might also be considered fornication. And those things, if they were said about you, would change the opinion of the society around you to you. In Saxon times, they had different laws across the whole area. They had no common law, but they did have certain rules that seemed to be established that were even codified and written down. They had the Leges Barbarorum, which was literally the law of the barbarians. Under the Leges Barbarorum, if you were a man and you were called a hare or a wolf, this was considered slander. And obviously it was actionable because if you action such things, it stops the response. Now, a hare can be considered slander. You can see why that is. A hare or a rabbit runs away when attacked, and being called one would certainly be an indication that you're being called a coward. A wolf, you might not think the same way, but wolves, for those people who've seen them and know how they behave, wolves fight in packs. In Roman times and up to modern times. I mean, in Poland they still have a version of the old Roman phrase, and they're described as człowiek człowiekowi wilkiem. A man is a wolf to other men. A wolf will attack in a pack. They will attack the vulnerable, and they will group together to do it. So if you're the type of person who looks for someone you think is vulnerable, and then you and your friends attack them, that isn't a brave and noble thing to do. Even a victory in those cases isn't something special. It is a form of cowardice. It is a cowardly behaviour to try and improve your own standing. And it was an insult to be called either a hare or a wolf, and damages were the same for either, which was 3 shillings. For a lady, and insults and attacks that claimed promiscuity or adultery were actionable. They were actionable at 45 shillings. With the division between the newly formed common law and the church in 1066, the church took the spiritual matters, and insults were considered lies, sins, and spiritual matters. So the church looked over and dealt with slander from that point onwards, dealt with defamation. In 1275, De Scandalus Magnatum was written. It was a statute, and it was a statute that allowed cases for slander to be heard in the King's Court. They were only heard in the King's Court if those cases were slander against a member of the aristocracy, someone of importance, or an official person, not for the common people. Obviously, libel was less of an issue back then because most written work at that time was done by monks and priests, and less likely to be libelled. De libellis famosus in 1606 brought into the arena and created the idea of libel as actionable. More importantly, of seditious libel, those things that were written or communicated about the king, which were capable of insulting the nation. The printing press had also come around that time, and so things could be disseminated more widely. The difference between the two, apart from the fact that libel is written and defamation is oral, is how they can be actioned. Libel is actionable per se. You don't have to show there was any damage or any harm to you, just that it occurred, and then you can take the action in court. Slander, you have to show that there was damage caused by what was said, with four exceptions. The four exceptions being, firstly, if it was some kind of imputation that you'd committed a criminal act, a serious criminal act, the type of thing you would go to jail for. Secondly, if it was an imputation that you had a disease, a serious disease. Maybe it's not as important now, but during the time when lots of people died of serious disease, for somebody to spread it around that you had the plague would certainly affect your opportunities to talk to other people. The third, very much something that follows on from De Scandalus Magnatum in 1275, was if it was something that you attacked your position as a professional person or an official of the state. And the fourth was something that remained from Saxon times. That was something that indicated that a woman was in some way promiscuous and immoral. The Fawkes Committee in 1975 looked at the issue of libel and slander, and it suggested that the distinction between the two should be abolished. It also looked at what could possibly be libels that hadn't appeared in case law. It looked at skywriting, for instance. Skywriting is something that is temporary. It goes away with the wind. But it's something that is permanent enough that they considered that would be a libel rather than a slander. The cases themselves are only actionable in high courts and above, and they are amongst the few civil cases where you'll still have a jury. In the first instance, the judge will decide on the evidence whether or not it is defamation. And then once decided, if he does decide that it is defamation, he will pass that defamation across the jury, who, as the common and everyday people or the community and society within which you are supposed to have been damaged, will look upon it whether or not they consider it defamation and what damages should be awarded. Now, there have been a number of statutes which influence this area of law. There's been Defamation Acts in 1952, 1996 and 2013. There's also been other statutes which affect the definition of what is and isn't broadcast under the Section 166 subsection 1 of the Broadcasting Act of 1990, and Section 4 subsection 1, Section 4 subsection 3 and Section 4 subsection 7 of the Theatres Act of 1968. Now, the best thing to do to look at this law from here on is to look at the case law. In the case of Croft against Brown, Judge Edward Cook discussed the idea of libel and slander and what actions should be taken. Cases were becoming very, very common, very popular, and he indicated that he believed that there should be certain rules in place as to when cases should be actionable per se and taken to court, and when they should only be actionable upon evidence of damages. The 1894 case of Monson and Two Swords involved the placing of a waxwork statue near the doorway to the Chamber of Horrors. It was this case which established that anything in a lasting form, even though a waxwork isn't permanent form, but anything in a lasting or permanent form could be considered a libel. The case of Bell against Stone from 1798, said it was a general principle that statements made were statements of truth, but they could be considered defamatory if they could be seen as attempting to look like statements of truth, even if the person making them stated that it was his opinion as he made them. This was again covered in the case of McGregor and Gregory from 1843, where it said that the circumstances around the statement should be looked at when the statement is looked at. The case of Safeway plc and Tate, which have reaffirmed the cases of Capital and Counties Bank and Henty and Lewis and Daily Telegraph, described how the method by which things were decided as defamatory and how damages were decided. It described how a judge decides whether or not the statement is capable of being defamatory, and then it is passed on to the jury, as said previously. The 1934 case of Yusupov against Metro Goldwyn Mayer Pictures Limited was the first case of libel in a film, and the case which established film was capable of being a libel. A film was made called Rasputin and the Empress, in which there was a rape scene. The victim was called Princess Natasha, but bore a striking resemblance to Princess Irina Alexandrovna, whose husband, Prince Felix Yusupov, had been involved in the original plot to kill Rasputin in his family's castle, which was portrayed in the film. She had never met Rasputin. In that case, an accusation of being a rape victim was considered libelous. Perhaps today it would not be considered libelous in the same way, since now, in today's terms, more disdain would be placed upon the person committing the offence than a victim. Lord Atkin, in the case of Sim against Stretch, provides a test for what might be defamation, in that the words tend to load the plaintiff in the estimation of right-thinking members of society generally. Now, when he says right-thinking, he doesn't mean those people who believe themselves morally superior. He believes those people who are simply capable of rational thought. Whereas the definition will stay standard, over time what people in the majority think may well change. The case of Slazenger against Gibbs & Co. from 1916 involved a case where a company had been described as being German and most likely to be shut down, and this was found to be defamatory. Of course, we're in the middle of a war with Germany. Not all comments are considered to be defamatory just because they are made about a person. The case of Blennerhassett against Novelty Sales Services Limited from 1933 involved a Mr. Blennerhassett who was well known in the City of London, well liked and well respected. An advert for a new craze with the title Beware of the Yo-Yo appeared, in which explained that a Mr. Blennerhassett had become an addict to this yo-yo craze and had to be taken to the country to be cared for in a quiet environment because of his addiction. Now, this caused much humour and much laughter at Mr. Blennerhassett when he returned to the office, but it wasn't thought to be something that would necessarily defame him, rather something that was merely humorous. Counter to that is the case of Burkoff and Birchall from 1996. Julie Birchall had made some comments in the newspaper and twice called the actor Burkoff hideously ugly. This was considered, considering actors' appearances are important, to be something that would defame him and that would affect his career, and therefore he gained damages. The first of our internet case is the case that was heard in the Supreme Court of Western Australia. It's the case of Jill Hardwick against David Randus. In that case, Hardwick had put a posting on a notice board, where things were discussed among staff, about Mr. Randus. The posting said the following: I have met the man myself, and my impression is that his entire career has been built not on a field research at all, but on his ability to berate and bully all and sundry on the logic of his own evolutionary theories. In the local pub, drinking and chain smoking, all the while for that matter. Secondly, and this is rumour passed to me by several reputable and long-standing West Australian anthropologists as to Dr. Rando's puppy parties, focused, I am told, on a local boy they called Puppy. Strange, dicey behaviour indeed, especially here in an environment dominated by conservative fundamentalists. This description, which suggested that he'd been fired for bullying and for sexually assaulting young boys, or a young boy, was the source of the action. And it was found that when you're on the internet, you can libel people. In the same case, we have the case, or rather nearly case, of Brock Meeks against the Suarez Corporation Industries. In this case, Brock Meeks was an investigative journalist and had written a piece about Suarez Corporation. He cited his concerns about them, and David Suarez decided to sue him for doing so. Mr. Meeks didn't respond by backing down. He continued to restate his concerns and to provide his backing and his support for his argument that he had researched. In the end, the case was settled for $64 worth of damages. Perhaps there was an offer of settlement to save the expense, but it also meant that the case didn't go to court, where Mr. Meeks was going to rely upon his First Amendment defence. Those of you who know the First Amendment of the American Constitution know that it defends and protects free speech and the press. To this day, the First Amendment continues to protect free speech and the press. Though whether it is a blanket defence will only be seen in court. I think it is likely that again, as Mr. Meeks did, you would have to show support for what you had said. The 2006 case of Keith Smith and Williams confirms that internet forums are public places, internet discussions are public places, and that libel may take place on the internet. Relating back to the case of Rhindos and Hardwick, the case of Stern and Piper in 1996 affirmed what was already recognised. There is no defence at all for you to provide that you'd heard or been told it from another source when providing information. You must make proper measures to ensure your belief that something is true and reasonable to say. The famous 1959 case of Liberace against the Daily Mirror involved an article being written by a columnist called Cassandra, real name William Connor, who'd written an article about Liberace using some rather flowery language, which, whilst not stating openly that he was homosexual, seemed to imply or infer that Liberace was homosexual. Of course, Liberace was homosexual, we know that now, but he was something he kept secret. It was something that was away from the public eye, and it was something that was certainly defamed since it was 1967 before it was legal to be homosexual in the UK. He sought damages, he won damages. This case certainly shows that you don't have an total defence of the truth. And then in some cases, even if you're telling the truth, you may still lose in court if you can't justify what you've written. As explained earlier, the damages are decided by juries. You can of course appeal to the Court of Appeal, and have been able to appeal to the Court of Appeal, if you believe the damages were too little or too great. Since 1990, the Court of Appeal has not only had the power that it previously had to order a retrial, but has had the power to decide upon new damages. This they did in the 1999 case of Clark against the Chief Constable of Cleveland Police. It says the Chief Constable of Cleveland Police, but it has to be understood that whenever you sue the police or any police force in the United Kingdom, you don't sue that police force, you sue their Chief Constable. In that case, they not only increased the damages for Clark for his wrongful arrest and imprisonment, or more likely for the special damages for those wrongful arrests and imprisonment, but they also gave a good explanation as to how damages come about, and explained how they're formulated in the court and explained to the jury. So where does this leave us in terms of YouTube, which is what we're on, or the internet in general? Well, the first thing that has to be said that defamation seems to occur every day on YouTube. It seems to be a regular occurrence, seems to be almost continuous, and many of these will be actionable. It's as simple as that. Some people choose, when they argue with someone, to simply defame them as a way of settling the argument. If you can't attack the argument, attack the person. This may be some kind of political system or political method for winning arguments, but it's certainly not an advisable one. If you believe you've been defamed, the first port of call is the publisher, the people in charge of the website where you believe the defamation is taking place. You may simply choose to contact them and ask the defamation to be taken down. You may choose to contact them and begin the process of finding out who this, usually anonymous person is, who's decided to defame you, and then move on to legal action. You may choose to tell the person yourself that you understand that it's defamation and that they might like to retract it. But usually the first port of call should be the publisher, and that's what my advice would be. Then onwards, well, if you've got the terms of services that we have in the UK, it will say that English law covers your, or will say in England that English law covers the case. I understand that in America an awful lot of them say that it's California law, which doesn't differ that greatly from English law that covers the case. I also understand that's the case in Australia, that you're told that California state law covers the case. Try and find out what the jurisdiction is. Try and find out if there's a big difference between the law in the two areas. There may be such a small difference as there is between the UK and California that it doesn't make a great difference which area you take the case in. There may be a great difference between the libel in your part of the world and libel in America. If you are taking action against somebody from America, remember their First Amendment rights. Consider it. America said it will only accept any cases of libel against people in their country if their First Amendment rights have been looked at in the case. It doesn't mean that you have to go along and decide that they have that as a defence, or that the judge has to. He may simply look at the First Amendment rights and say it's no defence for what they did. What they did was just a simple and deliberate defamation. Thank you very much for your time. Chat again soon.